Hey guys, welcome to my first drive video on BMW's 2024 X5 30D. And before we start the review, I'm just going to put this out there. I think that might be the best all-round vehicle on sale today. Towards the back end of 2023, BMW facelifted their ever-popular fourth generation X5. And a few months ago, I was lucky enough to go out to Austria and Germany and experience the flagship X5M competition. And although that was an incredible piece of kit, it's never going to sell in big numbers when you look at its starting price of about £130,000. This particular 30D with the M Sport trim retails at £73,500 here in the UK. That's today's pricing, middle of February. Don't quote me on that because pricing seems to be changing and increasing on a weekly basis at the moment. But this being a press car, well, yeah, you guessed it, it is pretty much fully loaded. The retail of this one is about £96,500. That's £23,000 worth of options, and we'll go through most of those once we jump inside. In terms of aesthetic changes on the outside with this facelifted X5, we're mostly going to find them around the front end and around the rear end. We have redesigned grills, which are active and now illuminate at night. Whoa! To be fair, when you do walk up to this at night and you unlock it, they do look pretty good. Redesigned headlamps and a redesigned bumper. And when you get around the back of the car, you'll find these new LED rear lights and a redesigned rear diffuser. Because this is a 30D variant, under the bonnet we'll find the fantastic B57. I've experienced this engine in many of my chauffeuring cars over the years and I do miss it, but more recently in 2022 I purchased a 730D to do a long distance challenge, and Patrick and I managed to drive that car from London to Madrid on one tank of diesel. We still had about 150 miles of range left when we got to Madrid. In terms of specs, it's a 3-litre inline-6 turbocharged engine. This very latest iteration is also accompanied by a mild hybrid system, which does assist a little bit with the power and torque figures. 298 horsepower and a whopping 670 newton meters of torque. It's the torque figure that's important with big, heavy vehicles. And that maximum torque is delivered at just 1500 RPM. When you combine that with the brilliant ZF 8-speed automatic gearbox and BMW's xDrive system, this will do a claimed 0 to 62 in just 6.1 seconds, and we will be testing that out shortly. It will also average about 38 miles to the gallon, although I've found that figure to be fairly conservative. Something else to mention before we close this bonnet is how low this engine is mounted in the engine bay and the chassis of this car. That gives you some kind of an idea of how well engineered the X5 is. It's always been a sports SUV, if you like. They've always driven very well from the very first generation. That's what stood it apart from cars like the Range Rover and stuff that back then felt really wobbly and useless on your favourite road, whereas the X5 has always been relatively capable for the size and weight of it. And this very latest generation, well, we'll talk more about that once we get it out on the road. Jumping inside, well, it's a beautiful place and cabin to sit in, especially with this extended chocolate merino leather. And I have to say, looking at the new 5 Series recently and spending quite a lot of time in the current 7 Series, I believe that the fit and finish and the materials in this X5 are actually a cut above. It looks like with all the very new models, like those two I've just mentioned, BMW are cutting costs in places. In terms of updates and changes, well, you can see that BMW have added the now familiar curve display, which is no surprise whatsoever. Importantly, we still have the iDrive controller down here. We've lost the gear selector. Now we have this little nub, I guess you could call it, which works okay and does free up a bit of space, especially when you're using your cup holders. These particular cup holders are cooled or heated depending on what drink you have in them. In front of those we have a wireless charging bay, USB socket, 12-volt socket, got a USB-C socket in here. We actually have 4 USB-C sockets in the back, 2 just behind here and 1 behind each of these seats, with a little accessory plug-in that I'm sure you can order, stuff like iPad holders or phone holders from BMW for your rear seat passengers. And the final updates that I can see in here are these vents, which I'm still not convinced about. I suppose aesthetically maybe they look better. In terms of use, they just feel a bit cheap and plasticky, but we'll find them in the current now 5 Series and 7 Series, etc. And we have a bit more ambient lighting, including this illuminated X5. Now let's quickly run through those £23,000 worth of options. I put them on my phone because there's no way I would have been able to memorise even half of those. The individual frozen grey paintwork that we talked about on the outside, £3,300. The coffee black extended merino leather on the inside, £1,950. Piano black trim. Looks good in the showroom, doesn't look great once you've had the car for more than a few months. This car is pretty much brand new and there's already a few hairline scratches on it, I'm sure from people cleaning it. And that's 560 quid. Air suspension, the best £1,200 you could ever spend, and we'll talk more about that once we get it out on the road. Electronic tow bar, that's 1,150 quid. Acoustic glass, £550. Sky Lounge panoramic glass sunroof, 2,650 quid. Very cool though. It's got thousands of LEDs in it, and at night they light up in the colour that you set the interior ambient lighting to. I had them in my 7 Series and clients absolutely loved them. Sun protection glass, 450 quid. Travel and comfort system, £600. I'm guessing that's something to do with a few little compartments we got in the boot. Tech Plus package, £4,000. Comfort Plus package, £4,300. And the M Sport Pro pack at £2,400. That is a lot of options. First things first, let's test out this car's claimed acceleration figures. BMW say it will do the 0 to 62 sprint in just 6.1 seconds. Conditions outside aren't perfect, there's plenty of damp patches out there, but I can't imagine we're going to have any traction issues in this. My Racebox Mini is ready to go. I'm in sports automatic, I'm going to let the car do the shifting, and I'm in traction mode, which is essentially what MDM used to be, so it will allow a little bit of slip. The reason I'm not turning all the traction control devices off is because I can't figure out a way of activating launch control when everything is off. My left foot is hard down on the brake, right foot on the accelerator, launch control active, here we go. Oh, that's unreal off the line. There's 50, and there we go. 5.54 seconds to 60 miles an hour, not 62. That is massively impressive. This is a big, heavy diesel SUV that does 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds. I think that is fast enough. I've had this car for a week and I've loved absolutely every single minute with it. My expectations before it was delivered were pretty high, and that's part of the reason I asked for this specific model in the first place. On paper, at least to me, especially wearing the 30D badge, well, I thought it was going to be a really, really good car, and guess what? It's even better than that. It really is very close to perfect. I have struggled to fault anything in this car whatsoever, and in fact we're going to start this on-road piece by talking about the one negative that I think might be common across all X5s, and that is it's slightly high driving position. These seats are in their lowest setting. My head is relatively close to the headlining, but that might be due to the fact that these aren't sports seats, these are the comfort seats. They're supportive enough and they're very, very comfortable. So that's one reason the sports seats might be a bit lower. The other reason is because this has the panoramic roof. Obviously that chops into a bit of the headspace. But aside from that, I can't fault it. I cannot fault this car. I've covered 600 mixed miles in the time that I've had this car. My 2-week-old British Racing Green M3 Touring hasn't moved from my driveway because I felt there's no reason for that car to move, because I've enjoyed driving this so much. Don't get me wrong, obviously the M3 Touring has its place. It's ultimately and dynamically a better driver's car, but as a form of transport, as a mode of just getting around, this car is just amazing. And one of its biggest standout features is its ride quality. So I think we should start with that. When you consider this particular X5 30D is in M Sport trim and has massive 21-inch wheels, you would assume the ride quality would suffer. BMW always tend to focus more on driving dynamics, and therefore you tend to get a slightly stiffer setup, chassis and suspension, even in cars like the X5. And maybe that is still the case, but not if you tick the all-important £1,200 air suspension box. And that's what this press car is fitted with. In fact, as we've already talked about, this press car pretty much has every optional extra available. And when you tick that box, not only do you get the ability to lift the car 40 millimeters higher than the standard default ride height, or 40 millimeters lower for things like loading the rear boot, which I must say is amazing. The split fold rear tailgate is so handy, it is lovely. You can stick everything in there. So not only do you get that massive 80 millimeters of adjustment that does change in certain modes, so when you go into sports it sits a bit lower, and we're going to get onto that very soon, but more importantly than any of that adjustable height, you get a beautiful ride quality. Really unbelievable. So good, in fact, that to me it doesn't really feel like a BMW. Okay, maybe a 7 Series, but that's about it. And aside from that wonderful ride quality, the chassis still manages to feel really supportive and taut. You never really feel like you need to come out of comfort because you throw it into a corner and everything feels really stable. And I know trick suspension systems, especially in SUVs or bigger, heavier cars, have been around for a few years now, and when you push them into a corner they stay nice and flat and stable. But the earlier systems that I tried in 2013, 2014 Range Rovers, they always made me feel a little bit queasy because, or seasick even, because I just didn't feel like I knew where I was. My head was telling me one thing and my inner ear was telling me another. And that's always kind of been the case with many of these trick suspension systems. But this very latest one from BMW, when you turn it into a left-hander like this, where you expect the car to roll and it doesn't roll much, it still feels really organic. It just feels like it's really stiffly sprung and supported, but yet we know it's not overly stiffly sprung because it absorbs all of the bumps on the road. So whatever they've done with this air suspension and this chassis, honestly, it is magic. And I'm not sure if the air suspension is available on the base 30D X line, I think they call it, but if it is, with the smaller wheels and the bigger higher profile tyres, well, I can only imagine that that car has an even better ride quality, but its handling might be slightly sacrificed. Before we stick it into sports and talk about this car's incredible ability, I want to talk about that wonderful B57 engine that is paired up to this equally wonderful ZF 8-speed automatic gearbox. You see, when you leave it in drive or default and you fire this car up and it's in comfort, so the ride quality, as we've already talked about, is really comfortable and supportive. When you go through bends like this, you don't feel like you need to go down into a stiffer setting because the whole car just feels wonderful. It's the engine and the gearbox and the way they work together is just magic. I think we're in third or maybe fourth gear there. I gave the throttle about 20% input, and the ECU had worked out at that point that we have loads of torque available from 1,000 RPM. So I'm not going to panic and change down gear because he's only asking for 20% throttle, and therefore I'm going to give him what he wants because we can in the gear that we're in. We don't need to rush around and find another gear. We've got it. And it's like that all the time. It's always in a gear that has enough ability. Even when you're fully loaded. I had my parents in the car the other day. We had a boot full of luggage and we're going along a similar road to this. It had loads of power and loads of, most importantly, torque in reserve everywhere, and therefore it wasn't changing down or changing up. You can push on along a road like this, leave it in drive, let the gearbox do its thing, and it just does it so well. When you're on a motorway at 70, 75 miles an hour in 8th gear and it's ticking away at 1300 RPM, you get to a big incline again with a few people in the car and luggage in the boot. It doesn't panic. This thing's 2.3 tons before all of those passengers, but it doesn't panic. It just uses that torque, that wonderful, wonderful diesel engine, and it just pulls you up the hill. And while we're on the subject of this engine, we also need to talk about this car's efficiency. BMW claim it will do about 37 miles to the gallon on the combined cycle. I've found that figure to be fairly conservative. I think it will really do about 39 or 40 miles to the gallon on the combined. And when you're sitting at a constant 70 or 75 miles an hour, it will easily do 45 miles to the gallon, which is massively impressive. When you pair those figures to this 80-litre fuel tank, you're left with a car that has a realistic range of between 700 and 800 miles. And I'm not exaggerating. Yes, if you're just driving it around a city and doing short trips, you might only manage 600 miles. But in the time I've had it, well, when this goes back tomorrow, the tank will almost be empty and I would have covered just over 700 miles. And that includes my spirited driving, my spirited moments, my flybys and all the rest of it. It's just massively impressive. As you can probably tell, I love this car. I'm really, really, really going to miss it. I think it just does everything so well, and we haven't got to its driving dynamics yet. In fact, that's what we're going to get to right now. If I reach down here and press the sport button, instantly I can feel the chassis stiffen up. I can feel the ride height dropping by 20 millimeters. The steering feels a little bit heavier, the throttle response a little bit punchier. I'll pull the gear selector towards me to give me sports automatic and then pull a paddle, so now I have manual gears. Well, this next bit is something I wasn't expecting this car to do. I just couldn't believe the first time I pressed all of those buttons and I configured it into its sportiest setting, turned the traction control off, etc. I wasn't expecting an X5 30D that's 2.3 tons to do what this car can do, because you put your foot down and it absolutely flies. I'm getting the same rev display on my dashboard and head-up display as I get in my M3 Touring. Turn it in here, although you can feel it's heavy, it's just unbelievably capable. And it revs all the way up. In fact, the red line, as far as I can tell, on this car and with this engine is about 5,400 RPM. And for the first time in my memory anyway, when you put it in manual and you put your foot down in, say, second gear, it will actually hold it on the rev limiter. Whereas in previous fast diesels from BMW especially, it wouldn't hold it in gear. It would always short shift or shift for you at about 4,600, 4,700 RPM. So they've somehow managed to add about 500 RPM to that rev range and allow you to butt into the limiter, which doesn't damage the engine. If you sat there all day long, yes, it might not do it much good, but it's lovely having that ability and knowing that the car's not going to shift up unless you tell it to shift up. Time for my conclusion, although I don't think you really need a conclusion, because if you've watched the video up until now, you're probably sick and tired of me using the word brilliant. But I'm afraid this car is brilliant. It's as close to perfect in terms of packages as I could imagine. It's amazing, and even the price at £73,500 base seems very reasonable in 2024 for a German luxury car that seems to do pretty much everything so well. And yes, this particular one is £96,500, which is basically 100 grand, but you can get rid of so many of those options. You don't need them. The one you do need is the air suspension, and that's 1,200 quid, as we've talked about. And when you compare it to other BMWs that are at a similar price point, well, let's take that i5 M60 for example. That's a 5 Series. It's not a full fat M car, it's an M Light electrified car, and the base price of that was £99,000. So the base price of that i5 is £3,000 more than the completely spec'd up, fully loaded price of this X5. Makes no sense to me whatsoever. This is a completely different category. It's in a completely different level, and unless you're benefiting from company car tax or whatever, you would have to be out of your mind to buy an i5 over one of these. And I know they're not completely comparable, but I just had to point that out because the pricing structure on electric cars at the moment is just all over the place. I can't get my head around it. That i5 had a realistic range of about 200 miles this time of year, whereas this has got a realistic range of nearly 4 times that. Progression? I'm not sure about that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I absolutely love my time with this car. I'm really gonna miss it. I mean, maybe BMW UK might want to give me a long-termer, because I couldn't think of a better car to have in my driveway to jump in and just use to get from A to B, and B can be a long way away, and it would do it without any stress or fuss whatsoever. Really good bit of kit. I'm getting an X6 M60i next, so keep an eye out for that on the channel, coming very soon. Thanks as always for tuning in and the support that you give me. I'll see you at another video very soon. Cheers.